let me introduce Robert from Laketide, Anders from Peltarion, and Daniel from Nordnet. Hey guys, welcome. So, I think we should start with doing a bit of polling. The topic of this talk is data first to AI first. So let me just ask the room before we start. How many in here would say that they are data first? Like half the room-ish. How many of you would say you are AI first? Okay. And how many in here still don't understand, or doesn't understand, it's fine if you don't, understand what data first or AI first means? Yeah. So I think we should start with going through what does data first and AI first mean. And let's start with you, Daniel. What do you think? What is data first?
Hard to say, but we made at my previous company some sort of stacked strategy deck where we said data first is very much having the metrics in the center, really driving the business towards pushing the needle in the right direction, and forcing a culture of logging and tracking data as a first-class citizen in all development work, setting the pipeline so the data flows freely, and basically being available and in the right state for processing and doing something else with it.
Okay, sounds reasonable. So, Anders, what would you say then AI first is?
Oh, I didn't get to explain data first. Well, AI first. I think one way to describe it is to talk about what big companies have said in recent years. So you heard like Google, Microsoft, and IBM saying they want to move from being mobile first to becoming AI first, or they want to be or use AI in the intersection of our ambitions, like Microsoft has said, or I think IBM said something about being the cognitive AI in the cloud. So the question is what that really means, but trying to actually switch from thinking about AI as a standalone product and actually thinking AI becomes a natural component of any kind of product and service they have. So making use of it extensively throughout the different products you have and seeing it as a natural part of the development is one way to start being AI first. And the second thing I'd like to mention is also being like innovative. So if you think about the way Google is doing it to a large extent is that they try out a shitload of different things, like 10 different approaches for solving some problem. Most of them will fail, but perhaps 1 or 2 out of 10 will succeed. And that is the way to be truly innovative and the way to actually make AI first work, I would say.
Okay. So taking from data first to AI first, what would you say, Robert, is the biggest problem with going from data first to AI first?
It's likely a lack of creativity, perhaps, in the same way that I think now people are much more open to the idea that every company needs to have an internet presence, needs to have a way of reaching their customers through a mobile platform and all those things. That wasn't so given 7 years ago that, like I said yesterday, a tattoo parlor needs to be able to reach their customers through their mobile phone. Now it's sort of a given, and it's going to be the same thing with AI, and people are saying, well, how is AI relevant to selling furniture? Well, it might not be obvious, and so the biggest obstacle into achieving that is creativity, really. It's going to be everywhere.
Interesting. So exemplifying this, some good examples of AI first companies, products, etc. So let's start here. Daniel, do you have some good examples? It's hard, I know.
Yeah, none that sort of pops up. I mean, a lot of companies are pushing the boundaries, like Google and I mean Facebook as well. But really, sort of pure AI first companies. I don't know, none of the big ones yet. I think there are a lot of interesting startups. We saw that in the sports betting industry. There are pure AI breed companies coming up, and they will disrupt the value chains and sort of push the business into a totally new direction, I think. But I don't know. Do you have any
well, I
of the
guess
more established ones?
And one famous thing is if you look at this hockey stick curve that Google has in the use of TensorFlow, for example, that they can certainly see that they are extensively using it not in a single specific product, but actually across a lot of different products. And that is really the sign of a company starting to become AI first. But another way to phrase it is also if you imagine, there was this quote from the founder of Wired say basically, you can easily imagine the next 10,000 startups. And they basically will take whatever problem X, add AI to it, and you have a new startup. So he basically forecasts that's going to happen in coming years. So what happens if a lot of startups is trying this, most will fail, but some will actually succeed, and you as an established company is not doing something about it. Well, you will be overtaken by these startups, unless you're doing something similar. So if companies start to apply this same mentality, I would say that truly AI-first companies are doing, they can actually survive in this AI-first world.
Yeah. Robert, do you have some real-life examples of AI-first companies?
I think it's difficult for the largest companies to pivot on a dime over to being entirely AI-driven, which is why we see a lot of startups being mostly AI-driven. I think our respective companies like to think of ourselves as being AI first, and it's like Anders just said. A big company could just steamroll over us because we're a small startup, but we're doing something that they could just as well be doing now. But we think, we've started with this traditional thing plus AI, and it's making it that much better. And we think it's going to be a success. So
awesome. So I have a question for the audience. How many in here would say you work for a big company? So let's say 10,000 plus employees. That's quite a fair amount of people in this room. So how would a big company go from, because usually big companies have a lot of legacy, they have a lot of data warehouses, old processes. How can they transitioning into being data first and then AI first? So do you have any good suggestions or examples that they can take home with them?
We should pick up on one thing we were talking about yesterday, which was how much risk a company can afford to take. And it might be difficult for any individual here to, take the reins and start controlling that thing. But we said that any company from the smallest startup to the biggest company should be able to give 10% of their time to risky business.
Yeah, I mean, being innovative is really crucial to do this. And I mean, the existing companies really have a good edge. I mean, they have the data. And having the data is essential for actually building some successful AI usage. So, I mean, take advantage of that and do it soon. Otherwise, the startups that actually don't have the same data, at least, will be able to do something that you could have done so much better. So, I mean, really think about, what you can start to either collect more of to be able to build future AI products is something you can do tomorrow. One of the more pioneers in deep learning, especially Andrew Ping, he basically said, in Baidu, the Chinese Google-ish kind of company, he basically said that we can even imagine launching a product, not for gaining money from that product, but just for the sake of actually gathering data, so that can be used in other products and services we have. That is, the proper mindset to have in being able to develop your own products and services.
But I think that's also something that needs to be a bit disrupted, that we need to move AI competence and AI skills and knowledges into the decision processes in those companies. Yeah. Because that's one thing that I've realized, that we sort of, in product management, we set the roadmap for 6 months, and then in the end we talk about, okay, what could we have done with AI? But I think AI is more about leapfrogging steps in the development process and skipping building manual tools altogether, and thinking really, can we automate this by the use of AI as like the definition of AI first? We need to think about that, and that requires skills as well, and alignment and collaboration.
So I hear what you're saying, that you should dedicate a lot of the time for kind of doing things that actually doesn't bring value instantly in big companies. But challenging that, and having a background in big companies, you all know that you need to motivate the decisions for doing something like that. How do you bring forward a use case that says, well, you're probably not going to make any money on this. We have no idea if you're going to make money on this, but you better do it, otherwise you will lose money. So how do you do a motivation like that? How do you tell the people in management position that they need to allocate minimum 10% of the time for doing these kind of risky projects, because they are relatively risky? So Robert, what would you say?
Well, it's good business. That's how successful companies do business. But that might be hard to sell to somebody that's higher up. I do think one thing that can help in motivating, though, is educating yourself on what's possible and what's not. And I had one customer that suggested we should scan bills that were written by hand and then figure out what it said in them. And they thought that the most difficult part was the character recognition. But it turned out, obviously, that understanding the content of the bill is much more difficult. And if that's not obvious, it can be very difficult to even know, what can we do with AI? What's the point of it? You can't leave that to the technical people. You have to educate yourself also on what's possible.
Yep. Anders, do you have any suggestions?
Actually, I wish I had an answer. I don't really. I think it's super hard. I think it's moments like these kind of events that really would hopefully give some insights into why it's necessary. Really to explain to people that if you don't do something now, even though it's not a short-term gain on it, other startups, companies, or competitors will do that. So it's a matter of survival, I would say. So either start being innovative now and experimenting with these techniques and start collecting data, or someone else will do it. I think that's one way to motivate people to start thinking about this.
I think we might sometimes, we're quantitative people, we want to be right, we want to be exact and accurate. Maybe we should wing it a bit more on the business cases, like everyone else is doing in a company. Not everything is perfectly well-gauged ROIs for everything a company does. So work a bit more on the visionary scale instead of like the exact ROI. Look at the potential to disrupt and potential to leapfrog other items as well. But that also means working closely in the sort of product pipelining and product management side of things.
Interesting. So, when we talk about AI in this room and on this conference, everybody's super excited. Everybody sees the possibilities. And everybody's kind of, yes, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. So, do you see any downsides with being AI first? Do you see any problems in the future ahead? Kind of the dark, gray skies. I know we should be positive and try to aim for the best, but what are the pitfalls that we should try to avoid? So let's start with Daniel again. Do you see any problems?
There are many problems. So the skill and the skill availability is one problem, of course. Which means if you bet really hard on AI, where you're extremely dependent on a few people in the company, that creates a vulnerability. So I think it needs to be more distributed across the company, so it's more ingrained in the culture of doing things.
Anders, do you have any?
Yeah, and one is just fighting the hype, so to speak. It's so easy to overstate what you think is possible and also build up too high expectations in what's possible to do. So really to say upfront in the beginning, this will probably fail with 80% certainty, and still being able to sell that to the company and to the board is important. So that's one way to make sure to set the right expectations for doing it, but it's still super necessary to do this. And the other way, speaking about challenges, there are so many things there. Skills is certainly one very important point, but another that I've seen far too often, even including in well-known companies, is that they're trying to build everything from scratch. They're trying to build the whole infrastructure for doing data pipelining. They're trying to do everything when it comes to how to build a model, how to productionize it and employ it. Try to avoid to build everything yourself and focus on the core business problems. The less you have to do with all this kind of plumbing code, the better. So being able to avoid that pitfall would be of great value, I think.
So where should you start? I guess that's a follow-up question.
Well, start by looking at, for one, how to get the right people on board, or how to educate the people you have already. Start to, investigate, what kind of perhaps cloud services exists, what kind of open source tools is possible to have, or what kind of, commercial platforms, libraries is available that will make it possible for you to so much quicker build the first prototype or proof of concept to start experimenting with. So that's one way to just very quickly start being innovative. and avoiding these kind of issues with just getting started of doing that.
Robert, do you have any pitfalls to avoid?
I think one thing that's worth bearing in mind is rationalizing the opaqueness of your models or of your entire solution end to end, and being able to not necessarily explain how it works, but at least being able to account for it and being able to explain this is what is happening in a general sense. Because I think if you can't explain what can be expected from your system, your customers might be suspicious of what you're doing. Your leadership might not understand exactly what you're doing, and a number of other things. So you need, I think, being able to communicate, like if we're talking about deep learning models in specific, you might not be able to explain exactly what's going on in the model, but you might be able to explain what's reasonable to expect from it, and a number of other things. So be ready to talk about those things. And even if it's not a deep learning model, even if it's a complex system, you should be able to talk about those things in a very pedagogical way, I think. That's going to be challenging in the future.
Okay. So how about the ethical aspects of AI? I mean, one thing is I was looking at your slides yesterday on the change of the most common jobs in the US. Truck driver, you mentioned. What happens when AI will take over and drive all the trucks? What is the ethical aspect to kind of automating and taking away people's jobs? How is that aspect? Is that something that should be taken into account when we become AI first?
Once again, I think seeing AI as a way to empower humans is, I think, the best way to do it. And I think every major company is basically doing that. You know, that's what IBM is meaning with cognitive AI, or even, you know, Microsoft said that as well. You know, it's really about the human and the machine together to just, you know, solve the most difficult problems we have. And just to exemplify one thing, if you take in medical technologies, and one of the talks we will hear today about how you can use AI to just help radiologists or people that need to build treatment plans for cancer patients. That's a task that's very time-consuming and require very high expertise. So if you can use AI to, for one, help, you know, perhaps nurses doing a lot of that job that doesn't have the same expertise today, it will actually increase the demand for that type of people, not decrease. So it basically means we empower people to do more complicated tasks by working together as human and machines, and that allows more people to do complicated tasks, and we can hire more people to do so. So that's another way to view it that I think is much more appropriate and much more positive as well.
Yeah. Daniel, do you have any input on the ethical aspect?
Yeah, but I think, I mean, automation and automating manual tasks has been throughout the history of mankind. I mean, ever existing, and I think we need to rather look at how we can sort of move on as a society. And of course, it will change things. It might even sort of push the right to work into another thing with like citizen salary stuff that we let the machines do the work and we can do other things. I don't know. But also I think the other ethical aspect that we discussed a bit yesterday with feeding models with very biased data, for example, sort of enforcing and really automating prejudice and equality and those things. I see that as probably a bigger problem.
So that's also a very interesting aspect of things. So what if we would, for imagine, have an AI credit scoring system, and we feed data into that like gender, race, income, etc. And it spits out and says, well, race is the most explanatory variable that has the most predictive power. So if you're black, you are going to have a bad credit score. How would you react to a model like that? Is that something that's ethical? It might not be the main cause why it's predictive, but it might explain like socioeconomic status, etc. So how would you handle an aspect like that, especially with regulations like GDPR coming that forces us to explain the models? So Robert, what's your take on that? Should we have that type of data?
Well, the data reflects, it's important to answer this with a longer answer in order to not back yourself into a corner. The data reflects a reality, and then the question is, can we change that by trying to counter the bias in the model? And I'm not sure that that's the right place to do it. It's obvious that pigment in skin has nothing to do with credit scores. I think that's 100% obvious. It might be that in a specific country, foreigners are less well off, and a number of complicated factors, and that manifests itself in the limited number of variables that you have when you're building your model. Now, what happens is that doesn't mean that the model's not correct. Statistically speaking, people, foreigners it might be, or whatever, might not have a good credit score. But that doesn't mean that that's the cause of it. So is the model bad because of it? No. Is the right way to fix it to change the model? No. Is there something we should be doing about it? Yes. But I think it's more nuanced than just fixing the model to not be racist or biased against women or whatever it is.
Unless, do you have any?
Yeah, I can share a personal anecdote about this. I guess when working at Spotify, I built this system just to improve recruitment process, because it's a very time-consuming task, and I personally worked far too much, I think, with that. So in just being able to more quickly review, candidates coming in, I built this system to just go through the CVs, try to basically model the probability that we will hire a certain person or a candidate. So I used that myself to simply just rank the candidates and manually review the top candidates, and that made the process more efficient. And I tried to pitch that to HR, and they very blatantly said, no, we are not going to use it. It's biased. I said, well, how is it biased? It's training on what humans have done in the past. So it's basically reflecting what kind of decisions we've made in the past as a human. And I think a lot is that people don't understand how these kind of models simply work. It's not as simple as if 80% of engineers are male, that the model will simply use the gender as an explanatory factor. That's not really how it works. But still, I think it's important. And I even removed the gender. We actually had a gender feature, but I said, okay, let's simply remove that from the model. It can't even use that as an explanatory factor. But even then they say, no, but it will find some other ways. So, I mean, it's a lot of, it's a sensitive topic. But still, I think you can make models if you do it carefully in a way that it is at least less biased than humans, which is potentially a good thing.
So the transitioning from human decision-making based on experience and gut feelings into a more data-driven AI approach isn't a smooth transition. Would you say that's a true statement?
Yeah, I mean, it can certainly be a bumpy trip for sure.
Yeah. So Daniel, what would you say about these types of variables that pops up in data from time to time? So if your company or on Nordnet would create a recruitment screening process, and then somebody goes to Diskrimineringsombudsmannen in Sweden and says, I was discriminated, and you say, well, it's just a model. Models can't be racist or discriminatory. What would you say?
But I think, I mean, of course, as Robert said as well, try to eliminate those sort of, I don't know, connected features, but not causal features, like race, for example. I mean, there might be problems with the society in general that has a link, but I mean, that is not the cause of it. It's other factors. So just try to remove it. And I think to gain trust for AI and as a company using AI, I think you need to be totally transparent. And I'm not an expert on GDPR yet, but I think that's sort of some things you need to explain why the model takes certain decisions. So you need to be really clear on the ethical side of how to do it. But I've sort of haven't encountered very many of those variables yet. So
I think there's going to be an aspect of jurisprudence that needs to be established when GDPR goes in, starts acting. And there's going to have to be a couple of brave companies that set the standard for what's reasonable and what's not. Does this mean, for example, that we can only have models that have at most 50 variables so that you can cut out any one variable? Because if you have a model that has 2,000 variables in it and all of them are non-linearly codependent in several layers, there's no chance you'll ever be able to explain that. And it's a really good model and it explains everything. So no complicated models allowed, because it could be bad because you can't explain it to some person down in Brussels.
I have to partly disagree, if that's okay.
Good.
But one of my favorite topics of research is actually being able to explain predictions, and it's still of course, very much more difficult if you have a deep model to do this kind of model introspection and explaining predictions. But it is possible, and it is improving significantly with the latest state-of-the-art techniques. And I wish people, and I wish actually the research were to improve so much more in the future, to allow even these kind of very black box kind of models that we are starting to use more and more to be more transparent. And I think that's possible, and we are starting to see that progress being made. So that's some light in the tunnel.
No. So we have like 5 minutes left, and I was hoping to be able to open the floor now for some questions for the panels. Do you have any questions for the guys on stage?
Hi, I have a question. So when will we have intelligence in AI? So I mean, currently I see great pattern matching. So, but when will we have true intelligence?
I can give a quick stab at that. There's a well-known phenomenon called the AI effect. It basically means as soon as AI is being used in a ubiquitous kind of way, it stops being AI because you understand how it works. It's like when Deep Blue beat Kasparov back in end of 90s. That was very magical at that time. But today you just say, it's just a search algorithm that goes through in a big way, in a very unintelligent way, in how to play chess. So it becomes unintelligent because we understand how the actual algorithm works. So is that really not an intelligent machine? Because it can beat any human in chess? Well, you can argue that. I think that's a question of definition of what intelligence really is. You could actually argue the same of the human brain. If you really look down how the human brain works, it's actually very simplistic. It's these kind of electrochemical kind of reactions happening. And if that's the only thing happening, is that really intelligence? I mean, always comparing, apples to apples is important. And having a true understanding what we mean when we say intelligence is even more important. But it's very funny to see this kind of AI effect happening all the time. As soon as something becomes ubiquitous, it stops being AI. And it's one way to explain it.
Yeah, we're just squishy pattern matchers, really.
Yeah. As humans, yes.
That's good. Any more questions for the panel? Okay. Yeah, we have one over there. I think that will be our last question.
The classical, the applications of AI tend to be around about two main things: computer vision and natural language processing. I want to forget about classical AI, i.e. the chess things for the moment. The main applications, when you think about those things that are being done, natural language is interacting with humans, and the computer vision stuff is mainly about guiding through complex environments. Now, is there anything else that you see sort of coming on the horizon that are being done with artificial intelligence?
Or okay, I can start quickly then. And I think one very exciting area that's coming soon is when you can use AI with unlabeled data. So today, especially a lot of deep learning models is requiring basically to have this kind of supervised learning, but we're seeing significant progress in being able to use like semi-supervised or unsupervised learning, and that's really how humans are learning as well. So even like one of the pioneers of the back propagation algorithm, Geoffrey Hinton, has said, he basically said his own work is just rubbish because the whole idea of how to learn using back propagation needs to be completely removed and replaced with something else, because it's not really how humans do it. And I think we can see some significant progress in the future in being able to have systems that can learn a bit more similarly to humans, and also work with data that doesn't require this very extensive labeling of the data. So that's one very exciting area, I think, in the future.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is also very neat is how publications now are talking of things more in terms of semantics. For example, the fully differentiable neural Turing machines that have external memory and that can learn concepts and how they're related to each other start to feel more similar to the way we talk about concepts being related to each other and having hierarchies of semantic concepts and that kind of thing. So I think the idea that we could imitate a human brain by following, this prescription, we're past that. But with the trial and error methods we're using now, maybe it's better that we're just making rapid progress without worrying so much about reaching that cutoff, which is diffuse anyway, knowing when we've reached the intelligence stage or not. Is imitating a human the goal here? Us, savannah survivors? Our optimization function is not dying. That's not a very interesting optimization function. And we are optimized to see, a couple kilometers over plains, walk on, maybe that's not the goal here with intelligent systems. Maybe that's not what they're going to look like in the future.
I think that's very nice ending remarks for this panel debate. It's now 9 o'clock, so it's time for the next speaker. I would like to thank you so much for being on stage and talking about these interesting topics. Let's give them a hand of applause.